So if I had to reduce the strange quality or the strange phenomenon of what has definitely gone on, transpired, continued on throughout my life from a very early age, is that I was aware, completely aware of the fact that I was being not just watched and monitored, but of a fact that was always somehow from a transient or etheric place, or I really don't still know how to put this other than that there's an aspect to the whole of the self that is being held, purposefully held away from the aspects here, right, that are tethered to the specific phenomenon that encapsulates the self, right? So what we're looking at is a scenario that deals with some very uncomfortable truths. One is the ontology, as it were, for lack of a better word, we see on a localized scale, on a mass localized scale. We have the sign, we have Heidegger's rendition or interpretation of this. We also have the phenomenon, the noumenon, and the various ideas and ideations of Welt. Welt built is Jason Reza Georgiani tries to infer there, and then Weltanschauung, just meaning Welt or world, and world view from a different parallax view of a different vantage point, or world as experience. So what we're faced with is that ontology as a generalized term is A, dumb. The ontology is stupid, presupposing, taking into consideration and factoring specific details as to say that this doesn't make sense, that when you begin to work with multiple skill sets, the techne, and you are juggling between the totality of doing a job well done, going through the artifice, so how we've taught one another, the artifacts that have carried on, and how we now have employed in a symbol that really demonstrates a brand, right? Family crest, that there's much more to it in a name, a family crest, that gets into doxastic aspects, which are to look at all layers within the material realm and those that reach beyond in the symbolic energy capture. Right, that this is a description. It's almost like looking at a cave painting and saying, no, you put these all together in a certain way and you begin to understand how did they live, what did they eat, what did they endure, what did they see, what blew their minds, what offered a Faustian deal to give them aid to remain living, right, under the threat of extinction. That is looking at your offspring, looking at your children and seeing that they would be born into the plight of this debtor's world, right? But that's a debt that they wouldn't even understand. And so you hope that they wouldn't. Then we get into the fact that most of us arrived here in debt. All of my family members were in debt. None of them could pay from Fungstad. None of them they could not pay their entrance fee to the fucking World's Fair here. The 13 prior to the 13 colonies, and then end up the offspring. I mean, think about that. Would end up fighting a war against one another. Most of my family tutelage, the Marstellers, came from the South. They patronized the South, right? When they looked at the whole thing, and that whole thing with General Custer and being 23 years old. It's like when you begin to look at it all, when you're not looking at history through this chosen lens of rose-colored glasses, you begin to see things as they really are, and it's scary. Napoleon's famous, to paraphrase Napoleon's famous quote, that history is just, essentially what we know about history is just made up by people who can give you the grandest, best lie, give you what you want. So again, we look further in, deeper at what the fuck's going on. That's always been the thing that I wanted to know, that I needed to know, that I had to know, is I'm looking at the inaccuracies. I'm looking at the fact that this terrible person that is my teacher, right, is quite aware that I have psionic abilities, where when this fucker is attacking me and degrading me, all I have to do is think about what a low level, low energy, compatriot of evil he really is, and they all masquerade as fundamentalist Christians. They're all able to get away with a lie. In fact, later I would figure out that if you set off alarm systems under the guise of abuse or neglect, as was the case with my father and my mother, the things that they did to me early on that were rituals that would sell me out later and prep me up for the most vile offenses done under the cause of a legal system that I neither understood, wanted to understand, nor from a natural perspective identified where it came from. And as I began to put this all together, and then finally beginning to study neurolinguistic programming and putting it into action, I came face to face with the reality that you are either on one side or you are on the other. You will either be the sort of a foot soldier for the cause and not question the authority, God save the queen kind of thing, not knowing what the queen's agenda is or who she works for or what backs her as far as the power goes. So later I began to compile evidence on my own. And I pushed the narrative. I pushed it quite far. I found that the only symbol that I could find that has any sort of resonant power is the inverted pentagram, which is startling, right? It's very disquieting. And I also found that this symbol allows for travel, but you have to lose other aspects of the self behind. The good parts, the pure parts, the parts that champion and believe in a world that you don't see before you, that is the illusion that we chase, that we are all chasing an illusion. We go into massive major debt, most of us who are on the border or completely haven't sold out, who champion this and are most likely just used for Loosh type energy, right? Because most people die in a humiliating and fatalistic sort of way, especially when they've been deemed as pretty good people, but they had problems along the way. Like, where do you get your golden mean? Where do you get your standard by which you judge everyone? It doesn't exist. In fact, if you added it all up, you would say, this is why we worship archetypes in media abroad at large, and particularly under the guise of celebrity, that are completely evil at heart, but they get their way in the end, and they had to sell out. But you're going to celebrate these people on screen, and you'll do these deeds that match up to this type of persona or personality, but there's no way you can go through living with yourself and not being fractionated, because you're always trying to go back to this presupposition that you are in fact good, and that is dangled in front of you. That the good, the pure, the right, the true, the principles that you know exist, society is built on a hearkening to this existence, but no one is allowed to practice them. In fact, when you try to fully employ and then deploy principle, right, you won't even be able to practice it on your own. We're talking about purity at its root, to purify yourself, to purify the inner sanctum of the self, and to go about the expression of this purification. You'll be stopped in your tracks. Not one person is able to do this. We want to believe in this sort of hazy, mercurial, abstract, as I alluded to in prior video, theme that somebody around the world is living pure. Some child, golden child in Tibet, and what we find is, as the world has shrunk around us, that is not the case. Everybody is living in this disquieting, disharmonic, not quite even to the junction point to where they could go through this transitional process toward purity. No, in fact, we're only allowed to produce just so much, and when we wake up the next day, it's stolen away from us, and we don't know where it went. We're forced into bargaining and begging when we get on the highway system, and we're cussing each other out, right, to get to that next place of advancement, which the tier system of advancement is completely corrupt. And the ideology of these corporations hails back to the same symbols, the same doxastic nomenclature, if you will, the true meaning, the root meaning, that through epistemology uses certain phraseologies and words now through a codified system, where you see people like Peter Thiel, right, Letmath, right, from the World Economic Forum, Elon Musk, right, you see all these people on the front of the world stage, Donald J. Trump, and you see and fully see that they are impure. You fully see that they failed themselves. Jeff Bezos, I mean, look at all the people out in the open, and when they didn't fully go into this, they're taken out. They're taken out, right, because they could only partially serve that which they bowed down to get to the status that they had in the first place. In other words, and this is what happened with me 13 years ago, in fact, is that you will go through the challenge. It will challenge you. It will say, how bad do you want it? How bad do you want this life and all that's promised to you? Kill the illusion. And those of us who say, no, I'm not going to kill the illusion, that is the greater part of me. That is the greater part of myself, right? So as I began this video talking about either the ontology as a whole, as an exchange term for God, is completely stupid. And then I alluded to, is either or let's just say programmable, right? Which seems to become a very evident theme here. When we're talking about CERN, when we're talking about the codified systems through AI, when we're talking about the people who are championing this left-hand path that are out in the open, that are showing their face, and you're watching them die and rot. The people that run everything from the Mormon, church, when you look at Miscavige with Scientology, and you look at the Temple of Set, the Satanic Church, when you begin to look at this, you see these people are being torn apart from the inside out. You look at their skin color, you look at this sort of sweaty Peter Thiel veneer over their presence, their person. You see this lost, dark look in their eyes, right? You see this sort of ninth gate final supplication where the devil is seen as this masquerading sort of angel, and that by extracting Johnny Depp's essence, his Loosh, his offspring, his lineage, his semen, right, he is then allowed in through these gates, the ninth gate, where they show this light, this enlightenment, right? That true enlightenment comes from an area like John Dee would allude to, right? Where you have come to this place where you have realized that behind the face of Abraxas, you do have this Jungian archetype of, or this dark night of the soul, that you have embraced this anima, this animus, that's not a bifurcation, doesn't necessarily sit antithetical, but is in fact this strange phenomenon that you could laugh at, right? Because the latest South Park is all about this whole 6-7 thing, right? But you have 6 principles on the back and you have 7 in the front. And when you look at 7, the 7 is the 8, because you count the purification that you began with, the purity, and the purification or purity or clarification that you go back into as you go through the 6 principles. But with the backhand of this Metatron's cube, seed of tree of life, seed of life, right? But we're talking about the root that other traditions, other attempts in rationalization as to fork off and add in a ligature to this 6 principle spherical system that emanates and comes from purity. We find that we look at the parabola as a capturing mechanism and also as an altar that looks identical to with the sharp points and the double ring and everything, right? That clarifies this is a statement that I'm making, right? When you look at the left-hand path, it's really the front-hand path and the back-hand path. And this is why people are being attacked from the rear, right? Literally, this is what's happening to our people. And when we say our people, there does seem to be a disparate separation, not only between the sexes, and then we get into races and so forth. And you're racist, you're sexist if you talk about it. If you talk about these differences that don't really seem to chime, that when we base things on principle and we go, well, this is what this means, not to believe this, but to have faith in this, right? How different races, different creeds, different systems that are inherent within the genetics, and this is a very touchy subject, right? Between the sexes, between certain types and kinds, right? Then you start to point at people and go, oh, you're into eugenics. What I am trying to look at the factuality and really get down to bare bones, as they say, of instead of trying to come up with the correct answer, instead of trying to formally fit in and meet the ends and to say, this is what I stand for. And so this is what I stand behind, now pay me. And then running off and seeing what that person is really all about when they have all of the resources available to them, to eat, to be in a space, to have a clear state of mind, to have all the things that are all the offerings of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that allows them to go through this proper mechanistic firing with Plutchik's wheel through emotionality and to build this, again, I wouldn't call it Loosh, because when it comes into the areas of the level of maturation, it is resetting the entire ontology. It is a prompt, it is a signal response, right? And the only thing that is allowed through, because what we're talking about is this messianic figure that can reset the entire systemization through event, that doesn't ask for permission, but exists in a superior form or a superior way, not only to the localized ontology, the Dasein, but the, or we could say the anthropological human quality of essence, but in fact is able to reset the ontology. So in summary, is the ontology stupid? Is it rewritable? Is it corruptible? Is the ontology working against us, or has the ontology been hijacked? Right? And when we get into this thought process and we go, okay, we're going to need to have a proof for this, a time and event, a postulation. Well, people have gone through this. This is what the study in the area of not only Tartaria, but looking at break-off civilizations that have come from Mars. And you better believe if this was proven, if the information was put out there for everyone to see, you would no longer have this disparaging, like, women are from Venus, men are from Mars, right? If you could conclusively prove such a notional aspect of this, or a certain type of people come from Mars, a certain type of people come from another planet, that this planet Maldek was actually did explode, and that it created this asteroid belt and this separation, and that there was a cataclysmic event that occurred on Mars, and this is the history, and we're going to disclose this. Like, we know that somewhere, somehow, there is archived information that leads on to why these symbols resonate and work with some specific peoples, even to the point where these people could intermix and intermarry, and then we get into that, and we go, wait a minute, you have multiple generations, 13, 23, right? You have these generations that have gone on for thousands of years that haven't intermixed with the pool saturation of the fodder, so to speak, right? That there is a complete and total family tree, a lineage. J.J. Vance through Operation GCD likes to joke about this, that from the Appalachian Mountains, his family tree looks more like a family pole, right? But when you look at these bloodlines, the same could be said, right? Where you not only just have second cousins, but actual sisters, brothers and sisters and so forth. And sometimes the case even gets more dark and diabolical, where they contended to continue these bloodlines on, but to keep the bloodline pure, right? Not offering any outside pollution, right? So we begin to see that the ontology is also probably racist in the sense that it can play stupid. It is rewritable to a certain notional aspect, but only by specific races and lineages is the application actually willing and accepting to the practitioner that is employing and writing or rewriting the code, right? So these principles are the code. This base principle number subset and the true ontology and the way that it sees things is at a base code that works its way into exponentials that generate and create not just the world where we are now, but resonate off into other planetary systems and bodies, where the true wealth in metals, metallurgy, and stores of wealth and a lot of the elements that come from starbirth and areas, dimensions, and levels unknown and yet unseen to us, maybe never seen, right? Where it's just so bizarre when you look at Johnny Depp in his entire life and the fact that he's followed the tutelage of this left-hand path and refound himself in the throngs of evil of the left-hand path and has gone through and never questioned this throughout his career and has posed himself as a superior agent out in front of everyone to go through these humiliation rituals and so forth out in the open, right? We see this happen time and time again, that a rejection by the masses and a refuting of this person as far as their principal orientation, in effect, is an aspect and an integral part of the systemization or this ritual that is played out in front of all of us, and we are considered the fodder. So when they are rejected by the fodder, they have no choice but to take up arms and to take up their tutelage and their family heritage in what would be considered the superior or the elite or those who sit above us. It's as if we are forcing them to do it. Of course, this is directed. Of course, they have been. This is an entire setup. Of course, this is the only outcome as our hands are being tied behind us, as these false laws are being cast around us. But they want it to be clear that by making the claim, let them eat cake, right? Or you want to be able to have what you want. You want to be able to eat your cake as well, is a better way of putting it. You want what you want, but you want the cherry on top, right? Well, this means that you're embracing the corporeal or the carnal, the physical, the temporal, and that you are choosing the artifice or the artifacts of this carbon-based world over the spiritual supremacy that this supposed Loosh is created or generated from. That harkens back to not innocence, right? Not an amniotic fluid amnesia, right? Amniotic-induced retry, but is in fact a purity that many of these people around you, but definitely those who sit in elite circles, do not have. They are not pure and they don't come from purity.